This is the story of Emily Carter, Olivia Turner, and the shadows that crept through the pristine hallways of Ridgewood Academy. It's not just a story about bullying, it's about the quiet, corrosive power of hatred and how it can unravel lives, thread by thread. The air was thick with the smell of burning rubber and damp earth. A car lay twisted at the bottom of a steep ravine, its metal frame glinting under the faint moonlight. Nearby, Olivia Turner lay motionless, her once immaculate blonde hair matted with dirt and blood. The only sound was the distant hum of crickets and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. Above the scene, perched on the edge of the ravine, stood Emily Carter. Her hands were trembling, clutching the straps of her backpack as if it were the only thing grounding her to the earth. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She didn't cry, nor did she scream. She simply stared at the wreckage below, her chest rising and falling in shallow, deliberate breaths. "This wasn't supposed to happen," she whispered, her voice cracking against the silence. Everything began with a lie. Ridgewood Academy was a place that wore its reputation like a crown. The pristine hallways gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the neatly trimmed hedges outside framed the campus like a postcard. Parents spoke of the school with reverence, touting its impeccable academic record and its promise of securing a bright future for its students. But beneath the polished veneer lay a darker truth, a battlefield of cliques, whispers, and secrets. At the heart of this storm was Emily Carter. A quiet, unassuming girl, Emily blended into the background of Ridgewood's chaos. She was the kind of student teachers hardly noticed unless they were calling roll. Her brown eyes rarely met anyone else's, and her words were measured, careful. Emily had learned early on that standing out came with consequences. For her, survival meant invisibility, even if it meant enduring the sharp barbs and mocking laughter that followed her in the hallways. Those barbs often came from Olivia Turner. Olivia was everything Emily wasn't: confident, charismatic, and terrifyingly sharp. Her icy blue eyes could cut through anyone, and her laugh, though melodic, carried the weight of a threat. As the queen of Ridgewood's social hierarchy, Olivia ruled with a mixture of charm and cruelty. She didn't need fists. Her words and her influence were weapons enough. Emily's only solace came in the form of Hannah Brooks and Sophia Kane. Hannah, cheerful and bubbly, was her best friend since childhood, but her loyalty wavered under the allure of fitting in. Sophia, on the other hand, was an enigma. A self-proclaimed outcast with a penchant for hacking and sarcasm, she carried her own burdens, a mysterious past that she refused to share. Together, they were Emily's fragile lifeline, though one she wasn't sure she could truly depend on. It happened during gym class, on an otherwise unremarkable Wednesday. The gymnasium echoed with the squeaks of sneakers and the rhythmic thud of basketballs on polished wood. Emily stood near the sideline, nervously clutching a ball she had no intention of throwing. Gym class was her least favorite. There was no place to hide. Olivia Turner, perched like a hawk on the other side of the court, was watching her. Emily could feel it, the weight of those calculating blue eyes. It wasn't long before Olivia acted. As the class gathered around the coach for instructions, Olivia brushed past Emily, a deliberate nudge enough to make Emily stumble slightly. "What the hell, Emily?" Olivia's voice rang out, loud enough to draw attention. Her tone was sharp, accusatory. Emily froze, confused. "What?" "You know what?" Olivia hissed, stepping back dramatically. Her hand flew to her chest as if to shield herself. "You grabbed me! Are you serious right now?" The room fell silent. Whispers began to ripple through the students. Emily's face burned with confusion and mortification. "I didn't," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "Oh, please," Olivia cut her off, her voice dripping with mockery. "It's bad enough you're a creep, but in front of everyone? Disgusting." The coach stepped in, his face a mixture of alarm and discomfort, but Olivia's performance had already done its damage. The room was buzzing with disbelief, and the way Olivia smirked as she turned away told Emily that this was all by design. Sometimes the smallest lies can plant the seeds of the greatest tragedies. Emily stood there, humiliated and trembling. The faces around her blurred into a sea of judgment and pity. For the first time, she realized that her silence wasn't protecting her. It was her cage. Something inside her shifted. She clenched her fists, the humiliation hardening into resolve. Emily Carter, the girl who faded into the background, had reached her breaking point. She wouldn't fade anymore. Emily Carter's world had always been one of silence and avoidance. But after gym class, that silence began to crack, and something darker seeped through. Humiliation had carved a space in her heart, and in its place, a cold determination began to grow. She started to watch Olivia Turner. Not openly. Emily was careful, blending into the corners of the hallways, the edges of classrooms. She kept her gaze down but her ears open, absorbing everything. Olivia thrived in the spotlight, her laughter ringing down the corridors of Ridgewood Academy. But Emily noticed the small details no one else seemed to see. The way Olivia's smile slipped when she thought no one was looking, the way her phone buzzed endlessly during class with messages she quickly hid. Emily began writing things down. She used a plain, unassuming notebook, the kind no one would think twice about. In neat, careful handwriting, she documented every observation. Olivia's routines, the people she spoke to, and the secrets she thought were safe. No one ever suspects the quiet ones, Emily thought as she tucked the notebook into her bag, but sometimes they're the most dangerous. Her first opportunity came sooner than she expected. Olivia had been whispering excitedly to her closest friends during lunch, her voice low but her gestures animated. Emily couldn't hear every word, but she caught enough. "Meet him tonight. My dad can't know." The usual spot. That night, Emily followed her. She stayed far behind, careful not to be seen as Olivia slipped out of her house and into her boyfriend's car. The boy, older and smug-looking, greeted her with an embrace that was far too intimate for a girl whose family prized their image above all else. The next morning, Emily sat at her desk in the library, staring at the anonymous email she'd drafted. It was addressed to Ridgewood's head of student affairs, a concise message accompanied by a photo she'd snapped of Olivia climbing into the car. She hovered over the send button, her heart pounding. Was this too much? Too cruel? Then she thought of the way Olivia's voice had rung out in gym class, the smirk on her face as the class laughed at Emily's expense. Her finger pressed down. The email was sent. Emily leaned back in her chair, her breath shaky but steadying. The quiet girl had taken her first step into the shadows. Behind the glittering image Olivia Turner projected lay a much darker reality. Ridgewood Academy's Queen Bee, with her designer clothes and sharp tongue, was not as untouchable as she seemed. Beneath the perfect facade, she lived in a world built on expectations, her father's, her brother's, and even her own. Her father, Richard Turner, was a man of immense power. To the outside world, he was a successful businessman, a benefactor of Ridgewood's elite status. But at home, his power wasn't just a shield, it was a leash. Olivia had learned from a young age that his approval came at a cost. Every grade, every public appearance, every friend she brought home had to meet his impossible standards. Any misstep was met not with anger, but with something worse: icy silence, a cold reminder of her place in the family. And then there was Ethan, her older brother. If their father was the leash, Ethan was the enforcer. He was fiercely protective of the family's reputation, his temper quick to ignite if he thought Olivia was stepping out of line. Just last week, he'd stormed into her room after hearing rumors about her texting someone late at night. "You're going to ruin everything for us," he'd snapped, his voice low but seething. She hated the scrutiny, the constant surveillance, but she had no escape. The only freedom she found was in her clandestine moments, sneaking out to see her boyfriend, a small rebellion against the prison her family had built around her. But freedom always came with a risk, and Olivia, as much as she hated to admit it, was terrified of what would happen if her father or Ethan ever discovered the truth. The first message arrived just after lunch, a sharp interruption to Emily's small moment of satisfaction. Her phone buzzed in her pocket as she sat in the library, flipping through a book she wasn't really reading. She glanced at the screen, expecting another generic school notification. Instead, it was a text from an unknown number. "I know what you're doing. Be careful, or you'll lose control." Emily's breath caught in her throat. Her heart began to pound as she stared at the screen, the words burning into her mind. She looked around instinctively, scanning the quiet rows of bookshelves. No one was paying her any attention. The library hummed with the low murmur of students working, blissfully unaware of her growing dread. Who could have sent this? How could anyone know? The email had been anonymous, the photo carefully taken without being seen. She'd been so meticulous. The words replayed in her mind. Be careful, or you'll lose control. The thought chilled her. She had been so sure she was in charge, carefully orchestrating Olivia's downfall. But this message was a reminder she hadn't anticipated, that there were other players in this game. And Emily, for all her planning, was no longer the only one holding the strings. Olivia Turner's morning started with an icy tension she couldn't quite place. The moment she entered Ridgewood Academy's front doors, she noticed the sideways glances from students, the hushed murmurs that died whenever she approached. Whispers were common at Ridgewood, but today they felt sharper, more pointed. By the time she reached her first class, the air seemed to crackle with something heavier. Her teacher, Mrs. Hartley, stood stiffly at her desk, arms crossed and face stern. Olivia, I need to speak with you. Now. Olivia froze. Her mind raced. Had someone seen her sneaking out last night? No, it wasn't possible. She had been so careful, but the look on Mrs. Hartley's face made her stomach churn. In the hallway, Mrs. Hartley didn't mince words. We've received a report about your absence last night. You were seen leaving campus after hours, Olivia. This isn't just about skipping school. It's about the example you set. I don't know what you're talking about, Olivia replied, her voice cool but tight. Mrs. Hartley wasn't buying it. Your father will be notified. Consider yourself on probation for this term. The words hit Olivia like a slap. She clenched her jaw, nodding silently as Mrs. Hartley walked away. But inside, anger boiled over. Someone had done this to her. Someone was trying to undermine her. In the silent hallway, Olivia muttered under her breath, her voice low and venomous. Whoever you are, you're going to regret this. Sometimes revenge doesn't heal. It only feeds the fire. And as Olivia's rage smoldered, she became more dangerous than ever, ready to lash out at whoever dared cross her. Sophia Kane sat at the edge of the Ridgewood courtyard, the screen of her laptop glowing faintly in the afternoon sunlight. She scrolled through lines of code, her fingers moving with the ease of someone who had been doing this for years. But her thoughts weren't on her current task. They were on Emily Carter. Sophia had agreed to help Emily, albeit reluctantly. At first, it seemed harmless enough. A little tech support to gather information, track movements, and provide Emily with the tools she needed for her revenge. But as the days passed and the stakes grew higher, Sophia began to question whether she had made the right choice. She glanced around the courtyard, her fingers pausing on the keyboard. The memory of her expulsion from her previous school loomed large in her mind. Back then, her hacking had been a game, a way to prove her skills. But when she'd been caught breaking into the school's grading system, the consequences had been devastating. Her parents' disappointment, the whispers of her classmates, the feeling of being a pariah, it had taken her months to rebuild her life at Ridgewood. Now, with Emily's plan unfolding, she could see the same warning signs. This wasn't a harmless prank. This was calculated and dangerous, and if it unraveled, they would all pay the price. Sophia closed her laptop, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. I know how this ends, she thought. But could she back out now? Emily was relentless, and Ridgewood didn't forgive easily. Trapped between loyalty and self-preservation, Sophia realized she was walking a line as thin as the code she wrote. It was late when Emily stumbled upon the file. She had been combing through Ridgewood's online directories, a routine search for anything that could deepen her arsenal against Olivia Turner. The Turners were untouchable, or so everyone believed. But as Emily's screen filled with scanned documents and financial ledgers tied to the Turner Foundation, she began to see cracks in their invincibility. One name appeared repeatedly: Richard Turner. Olivia's father, the man who loomed large in every corner of Ridgewood's operations. He was on every sponsorship banner, every scholarship fund. But here, his name was tied to something far less noble: offshore accounts, shell companies, and transactions that didn't align with his public persona. Emily's heart raced as she clicked through the files. There were whispers of bribery and manipulation, funds moved under the guise of charity, but funneled into private projects. It was clear these weren't the dealings of an honest benefactor. The Turners' wealth wasn't built on clean hands. She sat back, her pulse pounding in her ears. This was more than ammunition. It was a weapon, one that could obliterate Olivia's carefully curated world. All Emily had to do was send one email, share one file, and the house of cards would collapse. But as her fingers hovered over the keys, doubt crept in. This isn't just about Olivia anymore, she thought. This would drag her father into the spotlight, maybe even destroy her family entirely. The narrator interjected, a shadowy tone underscoring the moment. Emily now held a weapon that could destroy Olivia entirely, but at what cost? For the first time, Emily hesitated. She wasn't sure if she wanted to ruin Olivia, or if she just wanted her to feel the same fear Emily had lived with for years. The night was cold, with a biting wind that whispered through the empty streets. Emily stood near the old bridge just outside town, her hood pulled low over her face. In her hand, her phone buzzed with the confirmation she'd been waiting for. Olivia and her friends had taken the bait. It had been simple. A fake text sent from a spoof number, Olivia's boyfriend, inviting her to meet at their spot. Emily knew Olivia wouldn't resist. The idea of sneaking away, of being desired and admired, was too tempting for Ridgewood's queen bee to ignore. And tonight, it wouldn't just be Olivia. Her inner circle, Madison and Claire, had tagged along, as they always did. From her hiding place in the trees, Emily watched as the sleek black car came into view. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the narrow, winding road ahead. Emily's pulse quickened. She hadn't planned for this to go beyond a scare, a reminder to Olivia that she wasn't invincible. But the tension in her chest told her things might spiral further than she intended. The car slowed as it approached the bridge, Olivia at the wheel. Emily had placed a carefully staged obstacle, a fallen branch, forcing the vehicle to veer closer to the road's edge. "What the hell is this?" Olivia's voice, sharp and impatient, carried through the night as she leaned out the window. "Madison, get out and move it." But before anyone could act, the tires skidded. Olivia swore loudly, jerking the wheel to regain control. The road, slick with dew, betrayed her. The car spun once, twice, before its back wheel slid over the edge of the embankment. Time seemed to slow as the car tilted, its headlights now aimed at the sky. Inside, the screams of the girls pierced the night. "Hold on!" Olivia shouted, her voice filled with panic, but there was nothing to hold on to. With a sickening lurch, the car plunged into the ravine, the sound of crunching metal and snapping branches filling the air. From her vantage point, Emily stood frozen. Her eyes were wide, her breath shallow. As Olivia screamed, a part of her wanted to run to the edge to see if they were okay, to help, but the rest of her didn't move. Her hands trembled, the cold biting through her jacket, as the silence after the crash enveloped her. It was a silence so heavy, so final, that it swallowed her completely. This wasn't supposed to happen, she whispered to no one but herself, her voice barely audible over the rustling wind. Emily turned away, her heart pounding as she disappeared into the shadows, leaving the wreckage behind. Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket as she hurried away from the scene. She couldn't bring herself to look back, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on her chest like a stone. Her footsteps quickened, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The road stretched ahead, dim and empty, but the sound of the notification cut through the quiet like a knife. She stopped beneath a flickering streetlight and pulled out her phone. Her fingers trembled as she swiped to unlock it, revealing a message from the same unknown number that had haunted her before. "You think you're in control, but you're just a pawn in my game." Emily stared at the screen, her heart pounding in her ears. The words were precise, calculated, and deeply unsettling. Her thumb hovered over the reply button, but what could she even say? Who was this person? And how did they know what she'd done tonight? The timing was too perfect. Whoever they weren't just watching her. They were orchestrating something far bigger than she realized. Every step she had taken, every decision she thought was hers, suddenly felt like part of a carefully constructed plan she didn't understand. She scanned her surroundings, the shadows around her seeming to stretch and twist under the weak light. The emptiness felt alive, as if something was there, watching. The narrator's voice broke the silence in her mind. Who was this shadow manipulating Emily, and why? Was she a player in this game, or merely a piece being moved across the board? Emily slipped the phone back into her pocket, her pulse racing. The chill of the night seeped into her bones as a new thought gripped her. She wasn't in control anymore. She never had been. The crash changed everything. Olivia Turner survived, but she wasn't the same. The once dominant queen of Ridgewood now moved through the hallways like a shadow of her former self. Her left arm was in a sling, her face marked with faint scars that no amount of makeup could conceal. But it wasn't just the physical wounds, it was the way she carried herself. The sharpness in her eyes, the effortless confidence, was gone. The whispers followed her everywhere. "Did you hear? She lost control of the car," someone murmured near the lockers. "She's lucky she's even alive," another voice chimed in, tinged with the cruel satisfaction Ridgewood thrived on. Olivia's inner circle was the first to crumble. Madison and Claire, who had always clung to her like satellites, began to distance themselves. The accident was too much for their fragile loyalty. They avoided her calls, sat with other groups at lunch, and pretended not to notice her in the hallways. Emily watched it all unfold from afar. She had expected to feel triumphant, to savor the sight of Olivia brought low, but instead there was only a hollow ache. The satisfaction she'd craved never came. This should feel like justice, Emily thought. But it didn't. It felt like a reminder of how far she had gone and how much further she might still have to go. Emily sat in her room, the faint glow of her laptop casting sharp shadows across her face. The file was ready, the message carefully worded. She had hesitated before, the weight of what she was about to do pulling at her conscience. But now, with Olivia reduced to a hollow version of herself, Emily realized this wasn't just about payback anymore. It wasn't even about justice. It was about watching Olivia's world crumble completely. The email was addressed to Ethan Turner, Olivia's older brother. Emily had pieced together enough of their relationship to know what kind of man Ethan was. Protective to a fault, fiercely loyal to his family's image, and utterly ruthless when that image was threatened. The idea of Olivia sneaking around with her older boyfriend, a secret Ethan would see as a disgrace, was a ticking time bomb waiting to go off. All Emily had to do was light the fuse. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she read through the message one final time. "Ethan, I thought you should know what your sister has been hiding from your family. She's been sneaking out to meet this man. I've attached proof. Someone needs to stop her before it's too late." Attached were pictures Emily had taken weeks ago. Olivia climbing into her boyfriend's car, their arms around each other at a secluded cafe. The evidence was damning, undeniable. Her chest tightened as she stared at the cursor blinking at the end of the email. Was this too far? A small voice in the back of her mind whispered that it was, that she should stop now, but she silenced it. Olivia had never stopped when it came to humiliating her, breaking her down piece by piece. Emily clicked send. She closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair, her hands trembling slightly. A wave of cold guilt swept over her, but she pushed it aside. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This wasn't about justice, the narrator murmured, the weight of the words sinking into the silence. This was destruction. The message was gone, and with it, Emily's last shred of restraint. She knew Ethan would act, and when he did, Olivia's fragile world would collapse once and for all. And yet, as the minutes ticked by, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she had crossed a line she could never return from. Olivia Turner wasn't one to surrender easily. Despite the scars on her face and the whispers that followed her like shadows, she tried to reclaim her throne. She straightened her shoulders, forced her chin high, and walked through the halls of Ridgewood with the same defiant air she'd always had. But the cracks in her facade were obvious now, and no one believed in the act, not even her. She confronted Madison and Claire first, cornering them near the cafeteria. "What's your problem?" Olivia demanded, her voice trembling just slightly. "We've been through everything together, and now you're just... What? Pretending I don't exist?" Madison avoided her eyes, shifting uncomfortably. "It's not like that, Olivia," she mumbled. "It's just, things are different now." Claire chimed in, her tone sharper. "Different? She nearly killed us, Maddie. That's not something you just brush off." Olivia's heart clenched, but she didn't let it show. "You were in that car with me," she shot back. "You knew the risks. Don't act like I forced you." But the argument fell flat. Madison and Claire walked away, leaving Olivia standing alone in the middle of the crowded cafeteria. She felt the stares, heard the murmurs, and for the first time in her life, she was truly alone. At home, things were worse. Ethan's rage after discovering the email was volcanic. He accused Olivia of dragging the family's name through the mud, of being reckless and selfish. Her father's silence during the tirade was even worse, his disappointment cutting deeper than any words. The narrator's voice cut through Olivia's despair. Even the strongest can fall when there's no one left to catch them. And Olivia, once untouchable, was falling fast, with no one to break her descent. The messages had been sporadic at first, cryptic and unsettling, but now they came with chilling clarity. That night, as Emily sat alone in her room, her phone buzzed again. The same unknown number, the same eerie precision. "You're getting close, Emily. The Turners don't deserve their empire. You'll understand soon enough." Her hands trembled as she typed a reply for the first time. "Who are you? Why are you doing this?" The response came almost instantly. "Someone who knows what it feels like to lose everything because of them. Your part is almost done. Just keep going." Emily's breath caught. Her part? Almost done? The pieces began to shift in her mind, forming a picture she didn't want to see. Whoever this was, they weren't just an observer. They were orchestrating everything. The emails, the planted photos, the whispered hints. It was all part of their plan. But why? The narrator's voice deepened, cutting through Emily's mounting dread. The mysterious shadow had a face once, a victim of Richard Turner's schemes, a life ruined by his unchecked ambition. And now, they were using Emily as their weapon to dismantle the family piece by piece. Emily felt the air leave her lungs. She thought she had been in control, but the truth was undeniable now. She was just another pawn in a game far bigger than her revenge. The confrontation unfolded on a frigid Thursday night, the kind where the cold seemed to cut straight through you. Ethan Turner stood stiffly in front of the modest apartment building where Olivia's friend Ryan lived. His jaw tightened, fists clenched at his sides. All day his mind had been a storm after seeing the pictures attached to the email. Olivia and Ryan talking outside a cafe, their closeness unmistakable. It wasn't just worry, it felt like betrayal. He knocked firmly on the apartment door, the sound reverberating in the quiet hallway. When Ryan answered, his expression was calm, almost amused. "Ethan, right? Olivia's brother?" "You know who I am?" Ethan said curtly, stepping into the entryway without waiting. "We need to talk." Ryan crossed his arms and leaned casually against the counter, his tone neutral. "Olivia's choices are her own, you know." Ethan's frustration boiled over. He stepped closer, his voice low but intense. "She's too young for this kind of drama. Do you understand what this is doing to her? To us?" Ryan raised his hands defensively. "Look, I'm not trying to cause trouble. Maybe we should sit and talk this out." Ethan exhaled sharply, his anger simmering. "Fine. But this needs to stop. She's been through enough already." Meanwhile, Olivia sat in her room, her thoughts swirling. She knew Ethan had left in anger, though he hadn't said where he was going. Her worry deepened as she heard the firm knock of her father's footsteps down the hall. When Richard Turner entered, his expression was calm, but his words carried a weight Olivia couldn't ignore. "You've been pushing boundaries lately," he began evenly. "From now on, we're setting some limits. No unnecessary outings, no distractions. You need to focus on what's important." "Dad, it's not like that," she started, but he raised a hand. "Olivia, this isn't up for debate. You'll go to school, come home, and stay on track. That's it." Her shoulders sagged under the weight of his words. It wasn't anger she faced, but control, a tightening of her world until it felt impossible to breathe. Ethan's protectiveness and her father's strictness left her feeling isolated, as though the walls were closing in. The narrator's voice lingered softly. For Olivia, it wasn't a single moment that broke her spirit. It was the steady erosion of her freedom, her voice, herself. And the hardest part was realizing she had no way out. Emily stared at her laptop screen, the cursor blinking on an empty page where she had intended to write down her next move. But the words wouldn't come. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, shaking with the weight of realization. The pieces were all there, laid out plainly now. The messages, the suggestions, the evidence that seemed to fall into her lap. It hadn't been her ingenuity. It had been planted, orchestrated by someone else. someone who had a vendetta against the Turners long before Emily even thought of fighting back. She had thought she was in control, carefully dismantling Olivia's life piece by piece. But as she looked back, every step she'd taken had been guided, manipulated by the faceless figure behind the anonymous text. And now, with Olivia destroyed and Ethan spiraling into rage, the consequences of her actions felt suffocatingly real. In her quest for justice, the narrator's voice echoed in her mind. Emily had become the villain of her own story. The thought hit her like a blow. She had wanted to stand up for herself, to reclaim power from the people who had taken it from her. But instead, she had become someone she barely recognized, cruel, calculating, and consumed by the same hatred that had once been turned on her. Emily closed the laptop and buried her face in her hands. There was no undoing what had been done. And now, she realized there might not be anyone left to save her from herself. The hallways of Ridgewood Academy stood eerily silent, the echoes of its usual chaos muted by an invisible weight. Shadows stretched long across the polished floors, swallowing the corners where whispered secrets had once thrived. Olivia no longer walked these halls, her absence a void no one dared to acknowledge. Ethan's fury lingered like a storm cloud over the Turner family, and Emily walked with her head down, her shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of her own undoing. She passed faces that once mocked her, faces that now avoided her altogether. She had gotten what she wanted, Olivia's fall, her humiliation, but it hadn't brought the peace she thought it would. Instead, it left her with a hollow ache, a constant reminder of what she had become. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it a quiet unease. Somewhere, the unseen orchestrator of it all, Emily's silent shadow, watched, satisfied with the destruction they had sown. Emily had been their pawn, but the game was far from over. The narrator's voice lingered, heavy with reflection. In the end, shadows consumed everyone in the hallway. But was anyone truly innocent to begin with? Emily thought she was. Olivia thought she was untouchable. Ethan thought he was righteous. And yet, in the game of vengeance, no one remains clean. And with that, the darkness enveloped Ridgewood, leaving behind only echoes of what once was.